My story is long but tragically true, and I wouldn't wish my life upon anyone, not even those I chose to exact revenge on. I will have to accept and reveal a few things about myself that I'd rather not and I am not proud of. I was 19 when my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Things were very challenging. With my mom working 9 to 9, I took the job of caring for him. After a long 4-year battle with cancer, he passed away after a triple bypass surgery. My dad's passing completely changed my mom. I tried to be strong for her and me. These were indeed dark times. And they changed me completely. I didn't focus on school and my grades slipped. I also had to work an after-school job to support my mom because she was a wreck. Something changed inside of me. I had lived a somewhat sheltered life due to regularly attending church and church activities. When my father passed, if I wanted to go to college, I would have to pay for it out of pocket. I did not qualify for any loans. With everything at home and the constant demand for extra cash, my crap job paid me a minimum wage that got us nowhere. A friend introduced me to drugs. He told me if I needed the extra cash, I could come work for him and his buddies. They were drug dealers, and eventually I started to deliver coke for them. After some months of pushing coke, I raised enough money. I finished high school with enough money to fund college. I was several years into college. I never bought flashy clothes or threw money around to impress anyone. I kept as low a profile as I could, and I finished my BA degree in 3 years due to having plenty of free time. I initially wanted to be a lawyer, but I had known far too many corrupt cops and officials pushing coke. I did study law but had no goal of ever passing the bar because I wanted to become and eventually became a paralegal. I reacquainted with a high school classmate named Rita in college. We were close in high school. I discovered she and I had both had crushes on each other back in the day. But we were both too shy to say anything to each other without going into too many irrelevant details. Suffice it to say, Rita and I became friends. Best friends even. We fell head over heels in love and were planning a future together. Both of our previous relationships had been total failures. Mine in particular. It had left me feeling completely dead inside, as if I was incapable of loving. It had been years since I had dated on purpose. My previous ex, I will call Becky, had done cold and heartless things to cause our breakup. I was good to her, saving her from an abusive relationship, never abusing her and teaching her that no human deserves to be used. But she left me broken and in shambles. Finding Rita gave me hope, but it also made me recognize that every relationship before her had failed me. Rita was the love of my life. We were meant to be together. We took it slowly at first. 2 years passed and I opened more and more to her. I told her what had happened with Becky, my dad and all. She sympathized with me and she was very empathetic. We started sleeping together and eventually became a couple. She seemed to appreciate that I actually listened, spoke honestly and was protective of her. She said she loved me and I admitted that I loved her. I never told her how I'd paid for college or the things I'd seen or done. She didn't need to know. I was afraid it had ruined things with her. We loved each other and already had plans to start a family. A few months later, disaster struck. My mother had a terrible accident. She was crushed by a large shelving unit. It was pretty bad. She was taken to the hospital by the neighbors who found her. She had to undergo some medical tests. She sustained many injuries and a few broken bones. It was discovered that my mom had a leaking heart valve. The tests were to see if they could repair the valve. A week later, we got the good news that the valve could be replaced, but we also got bad news. During the tests, they identified 5 small masses in and around her left kidney, with a high probability that the masses were tumors and malignant. The doctors did a biopsy to discover she did, in fact, have renal kidney cancer. She began treatment and I knew I had to stay focused on my mother. Things had been going great with Rita. We had moved in together. It was a town about 30 miles from my mom's. When I told Rita about my mother, she expressed concern and support. When I explained it meant we would see less of each other. She assured me that she had no desire to put things between us on hold. She said she wanted to be there for me in no other way than as emotional support. I urged Rita that if she decided she wanted to take a break or thought she might be interested in anyone she met to say to me and I would understand. She assured me that she cherished me and that nobody could ever take my place. My mom started chemo. Initially, the chemotherapy seemed to have none of the horrible side effects. It was well into her second month before she noticed weakness and a loss of appetite. I talked to and texted Rita multiple times per day. Every day, she would message me asking how my mom was doing as soon as she woke up each morning. And we often spent hours before falling asleep talking and telling each other how much we were missed. We got to see and spend the night together about every 2 weeks, but everything seemed fine when we did. My mom's condition worsened. So I told Rita that she could go out with friends and enjoy life. As summer began, I knew Rita would enjoy going to outdoor activities even without me. My mom's failing health that summer meant no fun in the sun for me. Rita would go out with friends and I enjoyed hearing about the silly things she and her friends did. I was genuinely glad she wasn't a shut-in over issues in my life. She always expressed concern and sadness when I told her what was happening with my mom. The chemo was killing the cancer cells. However, she was growing frailer and frailer. I realized cancer was no longer destroying my mother. The medicine was. I needed to take a break. So a group of my mom's friends came to sit with her to give me a little free time on my own. I called Rita as I was nearing her town. She gave me the address of where she and her friends were to meet them. When I arrived, I saw most of her friends, which I'd already met as I made my way through the house to the back deck. I saw a guy sitting close to Rita. They were both laughing and cutting up with other friends. She introduced me as her boyfriend to the guy we will call Henry. He gave me a firm handshake. He said, "I'm happy to meet you." I acted politely towards him. I don't think Rita realized I felt something was fishy with Henry right away. I'm sure many people have a gut feeling when encountering someone suspicious because of my criminal activity many years ago, I guess. It takes one to know one. One instinct told me there was something shady about Henry. I knew he was new to their group of friends. None of them, including Rita, had known him longer than a couple of months. To be clear, what I was experiencing at the time was not jealousy, as I now realize. Rita had many male friends, all of whom I genuinely liked. But there was something I sensed about Henry that made me a bit skeptical about his character. I tried to ignore it, writing the feeling off as mere jealousy. I began to talk with Rita and her friends, trying to put my mind at ease. I monitored Henry from afar and interacted with him warmly. Rita and I stayed at her place that night before I had to leave and head home. Over the next several weeks, my mother's condition began to worsen. Still, Rita and I spoke and texted throughout the day, every day. In hindsight, I realize now that I was initiating most of our communication. But at the time, I wasn't keeping count. One day, a few relatives volunteered to look after my mom to give me a break. I headed to see Rita, calling her. On the way, she told me what restaurant she and her friends were having dinner at. So I made my way there. I was pulling into a parking space and saw Henry get into a late model black Buick. He pulled out, though he did not see me, unfamiliar with my car. I made my way inside, where Rita and her friends greeted me with hugs and words of sympathy and encouragement. We all had dinner and a few drinks before Rita and I went back to her place. Before bed, I casually asked why Henry had left before I got to say hello. Rita stated she had no idea and didn't know if Henry had even been at the restaurant. The restaurant we'd eaten at was in a strip mall with several other businesses. I thought perhaps he had come out of one of those stores, and neither Rita nor her friends had seen him. At any rate, I again stayed with her that night before heading back to my place about noon the next day. My mother became critically ill and had to be transported to the hospital by ambulance. She had pneumonia and was extremely weak due to the chemo and susceptible to many ailments for 3 weeks. She was hospitalized. They gave her many medications via and for, but her condition worsened each day. It wasn't good seeing her like that. The doctors finally informed me she had at most a week or so to live. I knew she would not want to leave this earth in that gloomy hospital room, so the staff arranged to bring her home and help me make her last few days as peaceful as possible. When everything was set up, we got my mom home. Though extremely weak, she was glad to see her house in familiar settings once again. We both knew she didn't have much longer to live. While she was afraid, she told me she wanted to be strong for her and also told me she was ready to go and see my dad once again after so long. I got one of my mom's friends from church to look after her for a few hours and got my car and drove to see Rita without calling. I hadn't called because I was crying hard, watching my mom suffer, and it was overwhelming. I wouldn't have been able to speak when I arrived because of my mother's impending death. At the time, I knew Rita would know what to say to comfort me. I got to Rita's house. I saw a black Buick parked behind her car. I didn't think anything of it as I was focused on soon losing my dear mother. I used the key she had given me to enter the kitchen as we always did. I heard music playing as soon as the door opened, but I didn't think much of it because I didn't see anyone in the living room or on the back porch as I walked down the hallway. Toward her bedroom, I heard noises coming from inside. I paused. Then I reached for the door handle. I stopped. I realized the sounds I heard were sexual. My heart sank even further as I pulled back my hand, not wanting to draw attention. But slowly, I put my hand on the lock and opened the door. A creak. I stopped in my tracks as I saw them completely naked going at it. Hammer and thong. Unaware of my presence. Honestly, my first instinct was to run full speed and headbutt him square on his nose. But I knew I had to stay out of trouble for my mother's sake and my job. So I slowly backed away. Shaking with anger, I went out of the house, through the back, and to my car. I wasn't seen. I just sat there in my car. The weight of everything caving in. Bawling my eyes out after about half an hour, I cranked my car and headed back to my mom's. I told no one what I'd just seen. Everyone assumed my tears were totally regarding my mom. They, of course, partially were. But the betrayal I just witnessed was like something so sadistic I struggled to grasp it. My logic knew my mom was my top priority, especially so close to the end, yet I felt so deceived by Rita. I felt a rage I had never known before, and I'd felt plenty of anger. I thought of calling her, letting her know what I'd seen and cursing her out. But I knew if she didn't care enough to be faithful to me while my mother was on her deathbed, a stream of profanity wouldn't bother her. I made sure my mother was comfortable and went to try and sleep in my old childhood room. I cried. I slept. I woke up crying. And I cried some more throughout the night. I woke to my cell phone ringing and saw it was Rita calling. I ignored the call and the urge to slam the phone against the wall. I went in to check on my mom, who was in a deep sleep due to the morphine they had her on. I managed to text Rita that I was very busy with my mom and would call her later. After forcing myself to eat and take a shower, the hospice nurses came by to check on my mom. After checking her vital signs, they informed me that my mother would die within 48 hours. I thanked them and walked out into the backyard, trying not to lose my mind totally with all that had happened and was about to happen. I managed to text Rita and told her my mother's condition was about the same and I didn't want to see her. I didn't want to talk to her and didn't want her showing up. I owed it to my mom to do everything I could to ensure her last moments were as peaceful as I could the next evening. Just before 6 p.m., my mother took her last breath with me by her side, holding her hand as her life expired. The next 3 days, I was in meetings with her pastor and making final touches on the church and burial service. But I could not, for the life of me, get the images of Rita and Henry having sex right in front of me. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I was mad at Rita, furious, but remembering how Henry had been so overly friendly toward me made my blood boil even more. If they hadn't already been intimate when I first met him, or they were soon about to. That made me want to know just exactly who the son of a bleep was. I paid a pie to run background checks on Henry. I had sensed from the moment I met him, he was bad news. I was actually angry at myself for ignoring my gut instincts. The pie, a friend from the firm I worked for, got back to me after a week with a file on Henry. There were mugshots of Henry from many years before. I was once arrested and have done some despicable things in my life. I've known people who have done horrible things intentionally and under the influence of various drugs and substances. Still, Henry had a long rap sheet for various crimes, several DWIs, reckless driving, and receiving stolen goods. Breaking and entering, drug arrests were listed as I moved down through his record, and the arrests got more atrocious. I discovered Henry had been out of prison on early probation for approximately 2 years after serving 10 years when I saw the charges included the sexual exploitation of a minor and a host of other sexual offenses. I admit, I was disgusted Rita had betrayed me, which hurt enough. The knowledge she may have risked me to God only knew what diseases that felon had gotten as a sex predator and then eventually in prison made me feel physically ill. I doubt Rita had any idea who she was involved with behind my back. She had a naive, trusting nature that had given her issues before, but never like that. I had no doubt anyone who knew of Henry's record would have considered him a vile creature. He should never have been let out of prison, but I had my mom's funeral to focus on and had to pull myself together. By the time her funeral was over and everyone had left, I was exhausted and mentally spent. As I put my head on a pillow to try to sleep, Rita called, not knowing my mom had passed or that I knew what she had been up to. She had been texting and calling much less in the days before my discovery and after. I answered the phone and tried my best to sound as glad to hear from her as I could. I didn't let on anything had changed with my mom's status, nor that I knew about her and Henry or what I knew about Henry. I let her do most of the talking and internalized every word I knew to be a lie, as if I totally believed her and appreciated her false sympathy when she claimed she missed me as we said goodbye. I lied and told her the same, but in all honesty, at that moment, if she dropped dead, I would not have cared in the least. I had a few weeks off from work with bereavement. I knew things with Rita were over and done with, but part of me couldn't help but struggle with how cruelly she had treated me, intentionally or not. I was glad to know the truth about her and will before any further lies and betrayal could occur, but I felt what both of them had done to me at a time when I was struggling to keep it together was just flat out wrong. I wanted revenge. I wanted to destroy both of their lives and yet never let either know I had any part of it. I called my Human Resources department and filled out the necessary FMLA Family Medical Leave Act paperwork to stay out longer than my given 2 weeks. I honestly had no reason to worry about getting fired, but I took the legal route and had enough to pay my bills for half a year or more if necessary. I needed to have my revenge on Henry. It was quite easy, as he was on parole and a felon. Even a minor charge would get him sent back to prison to finish his original sentence, but I didn't want him to just have to finish out his original sentence. I wanted new charges that would bring him so much time behind bars he'd never see freedom again. I'd met his parole officer on many occasions and she knew me well enough that if I had called, she would have investigated Henry's felons. With a record like that, I knew he'd have difficulty gaining employment. If he had a job, I had my doubts he was gainfully employed, in something legal, to be able to afford a new Buick and insurance. I parked down the street from Rita's in a car she would not be familiar with. I saw Henry's Buick in her driveway. I sat in silence and waited. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard him start his engine before pulling off from her driveway. I casually followed him, not wanting him to suspect he was being followed. It was time I did some digging of my own. Maintaining a reasonable distance, I followed the signal to a cruddy-looking house in a below-average part of Rita's town. His car was parked and he'd already gone inside. I wrote down the license plate number and parked down the street. I slept several hours in view of his house. After seeing no activity, I slept. At about 8 in the morning, I got out of the car and bought some breakfast. Throughout the day, it was easy to tell whether Henry had a large group of friends who saw no reason to stay and talk for long or he was dealing with a highly addictive substance such as cocaine, heroin or meth. After a few hours, many customers returned for more of the narcotics obviously he was selling and I took photos of the cars that stopped by along with some video. I went back each day at about the same time to document the continuing activity. I also observed each night at about 6 p.m. when I knew Rita was getting off work. He would leave. I trailed him each night to see him meet Rita at a restaurant or go straight to her house. I had major doubts she'd ever been to his house. At least not that house. I had enough evidence to turn in to the local police, but I decided to document his activities one more day as I knew he hadn't been out to get more drugs to sell that last day. I staked out his house around 3 p.m. People stopped coming by, which was unusual. I sat and observed when about 30 minutes later, a large black Cadillac Escalade pulled into his driveway. I had usually seen no more than one person to get out of a vehicle to go into his house at this time. I observed 3 large males exit the vehicle and open the back door to escort a middle-aged man inside. They stayed in Henry's house for over 2 hours, which absolutely nobody had been doing. I was fairly certain the middle-aged man was his source for the drugs he was selling. I drove by taking a picture of the Escalade license tag at home. I downloaded the photos and video I'd taken of Henry's activity to my computer. I made a detailed report citing the activity from the 4 days I'd observed what was going on. When finished, I printed out 38 pages of photos of people heading for Henry's door to buy drugs. I saved all video of the activity I'd recorded to a SIM card and placed it in a small plastic box for safekeeping. I knew it wouldn't take much to convince the police of what Henry was up to. I was giving the cops actual admissible evidence with times and dates stamped on each photo and video, but I wanted to put so much heat on him that the police would be the least worried the next morning. I went by the town's police station in Rita's town. I calmly walked in, requesting to speak with someone in their narcotics division. A uniformed officer came out from the office section, shook his hand, and I handed him one of my business cards. He stares at the card for several seconds and asks two of the lawyers in the firm I work for about me. The cop knew the business card carried quite a bit of clout. Even if I never passed the bar exam, I told him I had some information he might want to look at. The detective happily led me back to a conference room where we made small talk about mutual acquaintances, but soon I pushed a folder of paperwork in the box with the SIM card across the table toward him. Listed on the first page was Henry's first name, date of birth, criminal record, and parole officer. The detective examined the photos and I sat quietly as he did by the expressions on his face. He realized he'd been given information that could easily lead to an arrest warrant for him, but he must have also imagined how much narcotics those arrests could get off the street, potential promotions, and other positives. He thanked me for the evidence and placed the folder back down on the table. He asked me if I would be willing to testify. I explained the damning evidence was so I wouldn't have to. He smiled and casually asked if there was anything I needed. I explained that I felt Henry had been allowed off prison far too soon. It was apparent he had not been rehabilitated and deserved to go back to jail for much longer. The detective agreed, but again asked what I wanted in exchange for the information. I pulled out a photo of the black Escalade with the license plate number and pushed it toward him. I asked him to write the tag number down for his own benefit. I explained the owner of the Escalade might be an even bigger drug dealer. I reaffirmed I wanted my name kept out of any police or court reports. He agreed. I then lied and said my firm was representing someone who may have been set up by the owner of the Escalade. He knew I could have gotten one of the lawyers in my firm to call in a favor for the info, but he also knew lawyers like to use their favors sparingly. He thought quietly for a few seconds, realizing I'd given him yet another lead to potentially follow. I'd done more detective work in 5 days than his entire staff had done in months, so he happily agreed. 10 minutes later he returned with a printout of the tag with the name and address of who it was registered. I folded the printout and put it into my pocket. The detective and I made some more small talk about sports and cars before I shook the detective's hand and headed out to my car. I drove home knowing a judge would soon be filling out an arrest warrant for that scumbag Henry. I kept to myself for a few days, monitoring the arrest reports from readers' local paper online. One morning the front site showed a photo of a very bewildered and confused Henry being led away in handcuffs. As long as nobody had made any stupid errors to get him off on a technicality, he'd be finishing out his original time plus many additional years. There was always the possibility he might get a good lawyer to reduce the charges or find some loophole to get him off scot-free. I couldn't and wouldn't let that happen. I hadn't been driving for 10 minutes when my phone rang. The caller ID let me know it was Rita calling when I answered. I tried to act surprised and happy to see her without even a friendly greeting. She asked how I couldn't have let her know my mother had passed away. She'd seen the obituary in my city's newspaper. I replied that it seemed she was busy enjoying life and that I didn't want to burden her with my grief. I quickly asked why she hadn't been texting or calling as much lately, which led her to change the subject and ask to see me. I tried my dangest to act happy to hear from her and told her that I missed her, and I asked her if she could meet me for dinner at our favorite restaurant in our town, and she readily agreed since Henry was no longer around to keep time with. She was glad to have me back to fill in the void. I showed up to dinner with a smile and a long hug, trying to control the urge to break her spine in half. I was surprised she didn't say anything when I avoided kissing her. I'm sure she assumed in my grief that romance wasn't something I'd had in my mind much. I just had a very good idea what her mouth had been doing, and I didn't want Henry's prison germs on me. We sat at the bar and ordered 2 drinks from our favorite bartender. He knew us as a couple because we always tipped very well. When our drinks arrived, I excused myself to the restroom and typed a short message out on my phone that read, "Make my drinks with no alcohol and make hers doubles when I return to the bathroom." I sat next to Rita at the bar discussing drinks. We'd enjoyed it but hadn't tried it in quite a while. I acted as if I was pulling up the recipe for some unusual drink. The bartender came over and asked if we were ready for another drink. I told him we were celebrating after not seeing each other for quite a while. I held up my phone for him to read the message asking if he knew how to make that drink. He read the message and smiled, agreeing the drink I'd requested was a specialty of his. I'm sure the bartender and Rita assumed she could get as sloshed as she wanted to and that she'd be heading to her place with me afterward. I had other plans, commented how strong hers was. I told her I could barely taste the alcohol in mine. We ordered several more drinks. Rita commented about how drunk she felt. I acted confused, stating I barely felt a buzz at all. After several hours I paid for our dinner and drinks with a sizable tip. As we exited the door I acted like I'd gotten a very important call that I needed to take after the obligatory, beep, non-existent phone call. I told her I had to rush back to my town to the office. One of the lawyers needed me for a case early the next morning. I asked to go to her house and wait on me, promising the errand wouldn't take long. I helped her into her car and watched her pull off before using my cell phone to immediately call the police and tell them I'd seen a drunk driver leaving that restaurant. I urged them to hurry. The person was in no shape to be driving. I jumped into my car and headed to Rita's house about 2 miles away. About a mile from her house I saw blue lights ahead of me and slowed down to see Rita's car pull over. I knew she was going to get a DWI, as that is, in fact, what I had planned. Neither she nor I knew that Henry had been using her car to deliver cocaine to low-level dealers under him. They did the obligatory search of Rita's car and found several ounces of cocaine stashed beneath the back seat. I had absolutely no intention of getting her arrested for narcotics possession with intent to sell. But the fact Rita had given me her spare car key the same night she'd given her spare house key, I knew well I could have just as quickly been the one to screw my life up. Neither still had any idea I knew about her unscrupulous cheating that was revealed to all later. Update: I arrived back at my house that day and my cell phone rang from a strange number. I answered to hear Rita crying and blubbering while trying to tell me something. I got her to calm down. I actually wanted to hear what she had to say. She managed to tell me she was in jail, to which I innocently asked where and for what. When she told me that she had been arrested for, I was genuinely shocked about the drug arrests. I asked her what she wanted me to do. She wanted me to help her get out and asked me to post bond. I explained since my mom had died I couldn't risk putting up any of my property due to probate issues. I could have easily put my own home up as collateral, but I viewed her drug charges as collateral damage, and she damaged my life enough that the charges for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute carried mandatory time. I felt after what she'd done to me with who she betrayed me with, part of her deserved what was coming to her. I went to her arraignment and sat in the back, hoping not to be noticed as she entered the courtroom. She saw me. I gave her a look of confusion as to how she could ever be arrested for such a crime. I knew dang well how, of course, but I had to act totally oblivious when she tried to explain to the judge her boyfriend had been astute for dealing drugs only days before, and it had to be his. The judge didn't want to hear it. She turned around and looked at me with shame and tears in her eyes, realizing I knew she'd been cheating. I shook my head in disgust as they led her away. She knew, and the attempt to contact me ever again would be a fool's errand. Bond was set extremely high for both, and Henry, as he pled guilty and asked to forego a trial in an attempt for leniency, but he got none. Rita's trial took place a few weeks later, and she accepted a plea. She got 4 years with the possibility of parole in 3, but her career was over when she got out, and I didn't care one bit. They'd mess with the worst person they could have ever crossed at the absolute worst time to cross me.